In 1288, the Mongol Empire came to the Bakhdang River with the confidence of a force that had already made half the world kneel. It had broken dynasties, burned capitals, erased armies, and turned the word resistance into a delay rather than a strategy. When Kublai Khan sent his commanders south again, this was not supposed to be a gamble. It was supposed to be the final correction of a stubborn problem. Dai Viet had already survived 2 invasions. That in itself was an insult. Empires tolerate rebellion more easily than they tolerate repeated embarrassment. So the 3rd campaign was meant to settle the matter permanently. Ships, soldiers, supplies, command structure, numerical superiority, and the prestige of Mongol invincibility all moved toward the same conclusion. This small kingdom would finally be crushed. But on the opposite side of that assumption stood one of the hardest strategic truths in military history. A large empire can know war and still fail to know place. And if it fails to know place, then place itself can become a weapon. On the Bakhdang, Tran Hung Dao did not meet Mongol strength with equal strength. He met it with patience, tide river memory, hidden geometry, and the terrifying discipline to let the enemy move exactly where he needed them to move before revealing that the battlefield had been built long before the battle began. That is what makes this story so powerful. It is not just the destruction of a fleet, it is the destruction of certainty. The Mongols did not lose because they were weak. They lost because they entered a landscape whose logic they did not control against an opponent who understood that when direct comparison favors the invader strategy, must stop thinking in straight lines. The transcript opens with 30,000 Mongolian warriors, 400 warships, and a river turned into a graveyard. Those numbers matter, but the deeper structure matters even more. The Mongols believed the river was a route. Tran Hung Dao understood it was a trap waiting to be finished by time itself. The stakes hidden beneath the water were only part of the mechanism. The real weapon was synchronization between geography and decision. A trap of wood alone is an obstacle. A trap of wood tied false retreat and enemy arrogance becomes an execution. To understand why the battle had to be designed this way, we need to begin with the political pressure bearing down on both sides. Kublai Khan, emperor of the vast Mongol realm and ruler of the Yuan court in Dadu, did not view Dai Viet as merely another distant nuisance. By 1288, repeated failures in the south had become a symbolic wound. A small kingdom had refused submission more than once. That is dangerous for any empire, but especially for one that governs as much through reputation as through direct force. The Mongol weapon was not only cavalry or fleet or siege machinery. It was inevitability. Kingdoms often surrendered because they believed resistance would only worsen the terms of defeat. If Dai Viet could survive again, then the aura surrounding Mongol invincibility would suffer far beyond the Vietnamese frontier. So the 3rd invasion was not just military, it was reputational. Kublai needed a result that said the empire had merely been delayed, never denied. On the Vietnamese side, the stakes were simpler and harsher. There would be no second political life after defeat, no graceful reduction to tributary dignity if the campaign ended badly. The Mongols had already shown elsewhere what imperial punishment looked like when patience ended. So Tran Hung Dao, who had already fought them before and already understood both their strengths and their habits, approached the problem without illusion. The transcript says he knew he could not win with force. That is correct, and the importance of that sentence cannot be overstated. The first task of a great commander is to stop lying to himself about the balance of power. The Mongols were more numerous. Their ships were heavier. Their experience across large-scale imperial war was deeper. Their commanders were used to carrying momentum across countries. If Tran Hung Dao tried to answer them on those terms, he would only help them complete the kind of campaign they were built to win. So he asked a different question. If the enemy is stronger in direct comparison, where can he be made blind? The answer was not in a fortress, it was in a river. The Bac Dong was not just a waterway, it was a living instrument. It breathed with the tides. It changed depth, character, and navigability with the rhythm of water rising and withdrawing. Local fishermen knew it. Boatmen knew it. Villagers along the banks knew it. That kind of knowledge rarely looks impressive on a campaign map. Yet in regional war, that is often the knowledge that survives empires. The transcript emphasizes that Tran Hung Dao knew the river had memory, and that phrasing is exactly right for the kind of historical voice this deserves. He understood not only the channel, but the timing of the channel. That is what allowed him to transform the river into a mechanism rather than a location. Months before the decisive moment, thousands of ironwood stakes were prepared in secrecy. Each around 4 meters long, hardened, sharpened, and then driven into the riverbed in patterns too carefully arranged to be random. This detail is essential. The stakes were not a desperate improvisation. They were surveyed, calculated, and planted according to the tidal behavior of the river and the draft weight and expected movement of the enemy fleet. Wood alone did not promise victory. Placement did. That planning phase deserves more attention than spectacle usually allows, because it tells us what kind of commander Tran Hung Dao really was. A lesser leader waits for the invasion and reacts under pressure. A greater one begins fighting long before the enemy arrives by shaping the future battlefield. Think about the labor involved. Trees had to be selected, cut, transported, sharpened, and set. Work had to be concealed. The riverbed had to be read precisely. Men had to know where not to speak, when to work, how to camouflage the effort, how to preserve secrecy in a landscape full of people whose ordinary routines could accidentally reveal everything. Great traps are not only intelligent, they are administrative. They demand patience among subordinates who may not fully grasp the final picture until the day arrives. That is one of the signs of first-rate command, the ability to make thousands of smaller acts of obedience align with a single invisible purpose. When the Mongol fleet finally entered the Bac Dong system, it did so under the protection of its own assumptions. This is a crucial point. Empires are often not defeated by ignorance alone, but by incomplete knowledge reinforced by arrogance. The Mongols saw a river broad enough at high tide to support movement. They saw a lightly defended coast. They saw an enemy force that looked smaller, more fragile, and more mobile than decisive battle should have required. The transcript names Togan watching from the flagship and seeing victory. That image matters because commanders do not merely move armies, they interpret scenes. Togun saw exactly what he was prepared to see: a path forward and an enemy in tactical retreat. What he did not see was that the surface condition of the river at high tide was the least important truth about it. Below that calm water slept the real battlefield. Tran Hung Dao's next move shows another essential trait of strategic genius. He did not spring the trap too early. Many commanders ruin brilliant plans by becoming impatient at the edge of execution. Once the Mongol fleet was in the river, he still needed them deeper, more committed, more crowded, more convinced. So the Vietnamese fleet appeared in deliberately weak form. The transcript gives 30 light, fast boats, and that contrast is perfect. Against the Mongol Armada, they looked almost insulting. Too few, too light, too exposed. The right kind of bait is never strong enough to scare pursuit. It is strong enough only to invite contempt. The Vietnamese boats turned and fled upstream. The Mongols laughed and followed. That laughter is not decorative in the narrative. It is operationally important. Men who laugh at the enemy are already spending caution they may soon need desperately. The pursuit continued. Each meter deeper into the river tightened the terms of the future disaster. Tran Hung Dao, watching from shore or from prepared observation points, did not need to outfight the fleet at that moment. He needed only to outweight the tide. The transcript says he calculated like a watchmaker. Good. That is exactly the right image for how this should be understood. Strategy at this level is not fury. It is timing. The Vietnamese boats retreated until the Mongol fleet was sitting exactly where it had to be, above the submerged stake fields, clustered tightly enough that panic would spread through one hull into the next, deep enough in the channel that maneuver under pressure would become almost impossible, and late enough in the tide cycle that the water would begin to betray them before they properly understood what had changed. Then came the signal. The Vietnamese boats turned sharply and raced downstream. From the Mongol perspective, this probably looked like the final collapse of the prey. From Tran Hung Dao's perspective, it was the closing of the door. At first, the water changed imperceptibly. That detail matters because catastrophic battlefield reversals often begin at a scale too small for the dominant side to take seriously. The river dropped. Not dramatically, not with theatrical warning, just enough. Then the first hull struck. The impact was not symbolic, it was structural. An ironwood stake driven upward through the underside of a warship does not merely inconvenience movement, it arrests it violently. The transcript describes the first ship stopping dead as the sharpened wood pierces the hull. That is precisely the kind of moment from which fleet panic radiates. One ship halted in a narrow channel is not a local problem. It is a problem for every ship behind it. Then another struck, then another. The sound began to multiply. Splitting timber shouted confusion. The crash of vessels losing control in close water. The hollow violence of ships meeting obstacles they did not know existed seconds earlier. Then the river itself turned visible against them. As the tide kept falling, the stakes emerged. What had been invisible became undeniable. The channel transformed before their eyes into a forest of upward-pointing wooden teeth. This is one of the most psychologically devastating battlefield transitions imaginable, because it converts confusion into revelation. The Mongol sailors and soldiers now understood not only that they were in danger, but that the danger had been waiting for them all along. Every ship was suddenly a trapped body, trying to move in a space whose map had changed. Heavier vessels that moments earlier represented imperial confidence now became liabilities. Their mass worked against them. The closer they were together, the more useless their strength became. Ships collided, jammed, impaled themselves, or opened along the hull as water poured in. Others were left hanging or canted at impossible angles as the tide withdrew further. The Mongols were no longer a fleet in maneuver. They were a cluster of pinned targets. That was the moment Tran Hung Dao had been preparing for. The stakes were not the end of the trap. They were the immobilization phase. Once the enemy lost motion, the rest of the kill sequence began. Archers appeared on both banks. This is another sign of careful planning. A fleet trapped in a channel cannot fight effectively if fire comes from elevated multiple angles, while deck space is already compromised by wreckage. Falling men tilted surfaces and flooding hulls. The transcript says thousands of arrows began raining down. That image should be kept because once the ships were pinned, every deck became a killing floor. The Mongols could not mount a proper defense. Some ships burned as fire arrows spread across dry timber. Others became scenes of desperate compression men trying to escape flame, only to find stake fields below and missile fire above. And then the Vietnamese light boats returned, no longer acting as decoys, but as finishers. This is vital. They could move safely because they knew the routes through the stakes. Their familiarity with the river turned what looked like chaos to the enemy into maneuverable space for themselves. That asymmetry is the battle in miniature. One side sees a river, the other sees a weapons system. The transcript's description of men jumping into the water only to die there too is important, but it does not require excessive graphic detail to carry its full force. The point is simple and terrible. There was no direction of escape that did not still belong to the trap. Stay aboard and burn or drown as the hull failed. Leap into the river and meet stakes, debris, current, or arrows. Try to maneuver and strike another hidden point. The genius of the battlefield lay precisely in this. Tran Hung Dao did not merely create a dangerous obstacle. He created a situation in which each instinctive response fed another layer of destruction. That is why the battle feels so total. The enemy was not simply attacked. He was enclosed inside a sequence. The collapse of command followed naturally. Togan, like any commander in such a situation, would have ordered retreat the moment the scale of the disaster became clear. But retreat requires room communication and a corridor. The fleet had none. Ships were too close. The tide was against them. Every second exposed more stakes. The flagship itself, still perhaps intact longer than many others, could not impose order on a river that had turned against the fleet's entire physical basis. This is another reason the battle resonates so strongly in memory. It is not just that a fleet was beaten. It is that a fleet lost to an enemy who had made nature part of the chain of command. The tide kept carrying out the plan even when men inside the plan were screaming, improvising, or dying. By the time the water reached its lowest point, the battle was already decided. The transcript says some ships hung. Impaled, others split, others burning the river covered in bodies and wreckage. The numbers it gives: 400 ships entering, barely 30 escaping. 30,000 warriors entering the Bahdang, fewer than 5,000 emerging alive, serve a clear narrative function. Whether every number corresponds to exact modern reconstruction is less important here than the scale of annihilation they preserve. This was not a hard-fought draw or a marginal defensive success. It was the destruction of the greatest Mongol naval effort ever sent against Dai Viet. And that matters because sea power was the backbone of the campaign. Lose the fleet and the land army becomes stranded, undersupplied, psychologically destabilized, and suddenly vulnerable inside hostile terrain. The transcript correctly refuses to end the story there, because victory on the river did not mean automatic safety. Tran Hung Dao understood that too. One of the marks of superior command is the refusal to mistake a decisive tactical victory for complete strategic closure. The Mongol land force, around 20,000 men, in the transcript's telling, still existed. They were still trained, still dangerous, and now furious. A wounded predator is often more reckless and more lethal in the short term than a confident one. Tran Hung Dao therefore did not celebrate publicly or dissolve his command structure into triumph. He pivoted immediately to the second phase: deny regrouping, deny orderly withdrawal, deny the enemy even the partial dignity of escape. The Vietnamese War Council that night in a bamboo hut lit by torches, according to the transcript, is one of those moments where good commanders separate themselves from merely lucky ones. He gives the correct order: no frontal battles, no gift of open combat, no ego-driven attempt to test Vietnamese courage against Mongol discipline on terms that still favor the Mongols. Instead, guerrilla war, ambush terrain, nerves, starvation, poison, exhaustion. Let the enemy retreat through a country that will not let him retreat cleanly. That, too, is part of the genius of the campaign. The river trap works because it is designed. The jungle pursuit works because the entire society can be made part of the war environment. A column moving through hostile country does not merely face soldiers. It faces destroyed bridges, poisoned food, abandoned villages used as bait drums at night, silence in the tree line, arrows from nowhere, fear of every shadow, and the impossible task of distinguishing empty landscape from prepared death. The transcript describes the Mongol retreat as a kind of haunting, and that should be preserved in tone because psychological collapse is one of the most undercounted factors in military disasters. Once the fleet was lost, the army was no longer an advancing instrument of empire. It was a wounded body trying to reach the border, while the land itself seemed to reject its presence. Every ambush, every poisoned cache, every night raid, every vanished attacker reinforced the same lesson: the Mongols were no longer hunting, they were being hunted. The gorge, called Ham 2 in the transcript, becomes the final closing of that sequence. By then, the retreating army is exhausted, reduced, hungry, and trapped between urgency and geography. The path is narrow. The heights are occupied invisibly. The scouts report nothing because the best ambushes do not look like ambushes to men who have already been trained by fear to expect one everywhere. Togun knows it is probably a trap and enters anyway because he has no better alternative. That is the hallmark of complete strategic control, forcing the enemy to choose between bad death and worse delay. Once enough of the column is inside, the final signal is given. Rocks from above, arrows raining downward, narrow passage preventing effective dispersal. Panic. Then hand-to-hand finishing action as Vietnamese fighters descend from the heights. The transcript turns Togun's death into the symbolic end of the campaign, and that is structurally exactly right. A commander killed in the final retreat completes the inversion of imperial confidence. He entered as the emperor's solution. He dies as proof that the solution was impossible from the start, because the land and the people fighting on it had never accepted the premises of conquest. That is where I'll stop part 1, because the next movement of this script deserves full space. The destruction of the Mongol land army after the river battle, the death of Togun in the gorge, the return of fewer than 200 survivors, the reaction at Kublai Khan's court in Dadu, the political cost of the defeat to the empire's myth of invincibility, and the final legacy of Tran Hung. Dao, his retreat to the mountains, his military writings, the preservation of his tactics for later generations, and the reason the Bac Dang River remained not just a battlefield, but a national memory of how a smaller people can defeat a larger empire by understanding that intelligence, patience, and terrain can become greater weapons than numbers.
Intelligence and patience conquer numbers.